Hello, welcome back to another episode of I'm Not Triggered, the podcast. My name is Adrienne Purchase. Thank you so much for joining me today. Here we talk about mental health, we talk about well-being, we talk about how to regulate our emotions in a world that is just chaotic, it seems like. And we do all of that using skills from Dialectical Behavior Therapy, DBT, which was made by Dr. Marsha Linehan. So my DBT journey, like most mental health journeys, started with me feeling broken, lost. I didn't really have a sense of identity. I didn't know who I was. And somehow I also, without knowing who I was, didn't like who I was. It was a hard way to live. And when I found DBT, it found me. It started to change all of that. So what I've realized is the healing journey is just nonlinear and it never ends until we're in the grave, right? And I think I've come to accept that, which has made living life a little bit easier for sure. So these 5 lessons that I'm going to share with you today, think of them as like gateways into changes in our self-perception and our perception of the world and the people in it and in our lives. So the first lesson that I learned from 1 year in DBT is that emotions are information, they are not facts. Even though they feel really factual in the moment, right? When we have a moment of just incredible anger or sadness, it feels like that moment will go on forever, and the suffering that comes along with the thought that this pain might continue, or my favorite one, that we will have this pain again. We have to make it worth having that pain again, right? So when we have it again, we don't have all of these emotions that just consume us. Instead, we can step out of that moment, out of that anger, out of that sadness, out of these emotions. We can step out of them and we can start to look at them as information about how an environment, a situation, a relationship, an activity is making us feel. And once we do that, then we start to really get to know who we are. Because we are not our emotions. I really believed for a long time that I was just my emotions and I was just emotional and that was my whole identity. That was just what I was. And I no longer believe that to be true. And that's a DBT shift. Because I now understand that my emotions are just messengers. They're just giving me information so that I can get to know myself better and I can get to know my relationships better. I've also realized and learned that denying my emotions, burying them, suppressing them, just makes them resurface in really distorted ways that are completely inappropriate for whatever the situation is. I remember one time I had a friend with me. We love to talk about this. And we were at Chipotle, and I remember having gotten a military discount. I think it was like once or twice I'd gone. But this time when I went in with my friend and I asked for the discount, they said, no, they don't do that. I was furious. So mad. I acted like a child. I threw a tantrum and I stormed out, yelling and screaming and really inappropriate, mean things, actually, for a 30-some-odd-old woman to do in a Chipotle restaurant over a 10% discount. And I didn't understand then that that was just emotion reactivity and distorted feelings from something else, lots of other things that I hadn't even begun to work on. So we bring all of these things with us in every moment that we go into. If we don't work through and navigate through these emotions as they come up, they start to pile up. We all know that, right? And then we try to push them down further. But we run out of space and eventually they got to go somewhere. And then they all come out at once. And that really feels like it'll never end. And that's a terrible, terrible feeling to have. It feels overwhelming and completely hopeless for me anyway. So I've learned that I can handle my pain because emotions are not facts. They're just information. I've learned a lot from just allowing myself to have emotions and not taking them as gospel truth. So lesson 2, the second thing I learned from 1 year in DBT, radical acceptance, lessens suffering. Every therapist I've ever had, I think, has talked to me about radical acceptance. My chosen religion, Buddhism, very loosely, is kind of based on radical acceptance of like this belief that if you radically accept your reality, it lessens suffering. And I called bullshit on that for a really long time. And it took a year in DBT therapy for me to understand that not accepting reality does not change what happened, nor can it change what is happening, nor will it change the outcome. It won't. I don't have that kind of power. But to deny reality is to cause internal suffering because now I'm living in a world that isn't real. That sounds awful. But we do that out of self-protection. When we can radically accept the most awful of situations, we can begin to have hope, choice, and power. Now, Viktor Frankl, famously known author, Holocaust survivor, scientist, he went on to do amazing things with his life. After surviving the Holocaust, like in the camp, he was in the camp. And he, for years, I think, and he has concluded, and we know this to be true now, that human suffering is universal. And there's a difference between isolating ourselves, being alone with our suffering, and having people bear witness or sit with us in our suffering. That one has a lot more hope. I wrote the book, A Man's Search for Meaning. If you haven't read it, I had to read that in high school. If you haven't read it, it will probably change your perspective on life. I don't know how it couldn't, actually. Not to diminish what we've gone through. Like, I didn't survive the Holocaust, right? But the things that I've gone through, the trauma that I've suffered, is just as equally damaging for me as the Holocaust was for Viktor Frankl. Because we're all different people with different experiences. So to accept what's happened to me has allowed me to take the power and do something with it, like start a newsletter, start a podcast, and to know that I can do something with that because I accepted it. I had to make some really hard choices when I accepted the truth of my reality. But that's why we deny ourselves reality, because we don't want to have to make these choices. But these choices are choices that need to be made if we want to stop suffering. Now that we know that pain will always come and go, just like happiness and anger and sadness and love, all of the things, I've then learned also, lesson number 3 has been the way I reacted at Chipotle, the way I react is because of a lot of other things, not just that one thing. When someone cuts you off in traffic, of course, that's irritating because it threatens your sense of safety. Yeah, you threaten my sense of safety and all of my physiological things are going to kick in to keep me alive. And that oftentimes means being very aggressive. We want to do something with the rage that we feel, which is because of the threatening of our safety. Okay, that's why we feel angry. But my reaction grows bigger at incidences like this when I don't work through all the other incidents that have caused that same reaction. They just pile up. So every time someone cuts me off in traffic, the narrative is, well, here we go again. And it's not all personal. It feels like it is, but it's not, So the moment we react in a situation, we react a certain way because we have a certain history with those situations, with those people, with those environments, and we don't just get a clean slate every time we go into a new interaction with someone. All this shit's still there unless we clean the slate ourselves as we go. The way to kind of change our reactions is to do something what's called a behavior chain analysis. I talked a little bit or wrote a little bit about this in a post, and I'll link that, about habit change. Touched on it. But I'll do a whole episode and a write-up on our chain analysis from a DBT perspective. But essentially what we do is we look at the traffic incident. Someone cut me off. That's the fact, right? I feel angry because of this. Also factual. So now I'm going to chase this person down, which has happened to me, right? I'm sure probably some crazy stuff's happened to you. Pre-DBT lived in the tyranny of the moment, reacting incredibly impulsively, and then hating myself for the way that I reacted, which just perpetuated this cycle of self-hatred and self-loathing, which was very destructive. So chain analysis allows us to start from the end. Okay, I ended up chasing this person down after they cut me off in traffic. What could I do differently so that when someone cuts me off again, because it will likely happen, what can I do differently so that I don't end up chasing them off the side of the road and maybe in a very unsafe situation? We could probably do a lot of things differently, but the first one is to understand that mistakes happen. Maybe it was a mistake that they cut you off, right? It's just interesting to think about how we react today is literally because of all the things that happened before today. And it takes time to undo those thinking patterns that have us chase this person down the road. It's taken a lot. I mean, I still really want to. I want to be very clear. The urge has not gone away. It hasn't, and it's not really lessened either. I just don't let it decide my next moves. That's it. Which sounds really simple, but it's been over a year of all these skills together. Being able to do that and still have the emotion, which can be distressing, but I know how to handle that distress now. And I learned that too. That's not the lesson. That's not the next lesson. But lesson number 4, negative beliefs that we have about ourselves, about others, about the world around us are often harmful, 99% of the time, untrue. And these beliefs that we don't actually know that we have, they're so deep and subconscious, and we act from these beliefs. We have no idea that that's what's happening for us. And in order to become aware of these negative beliefs so that we can challenge them and break them down over time, is to come to terms with the fact that we tell ourselves some really terrible things. We've heard some really terrible things about ourselves. We were told certain things, as children, teenagers, adults, in toxic, unhealthy, abusive relationships. We were invalidated and dismissed. And all of that leads to a negative belief system. These negative beliefs have become invisible maps. They're like the architecture of every interaction I have, even with myself. So some negative beliefs that I had when I started DBT, still working through them, but they're much less now. I don't believe them as much, but I still believe them a little bit, that I was unworthy of love, that I am too needy, that I was crazy, that I was internally flawed and did not belong. So to say that I've worked through all of those negative beliefs would be a lie. And like I said, I don't believe them as much. I'm still too hard on myself and others and the world. I have too much judgment. I'm still working on that part, which I know. I know that about myself. So then at least now I can do something about it because I've accepted that, right? It sucks that I'm so judgmental. I know where it comes from. Once you realize that you're acting from a place that's against your own values as a person, there's a level of guilt and shame that came with that for me, but that's what motivated me to change. It wasn't really the pain that I was causing myself that motivated me to change. It wasn't. It was because I have a family that I care deeply about. When I realized I was going to lose the most important relationship in my life and that I could maybe just have a different outcome if I did things differently, I was like, fuck it. I had nothing left to lose at that point, you know? So maybe it's when we individually find our own, they call it a rock bottom, but I don't really like that term, like our low points, right? We can take these low points and use them to motivate us to change. Now, small positive experiences over time, which is called accumulating positives, leads to a deep-seated negative belief, like tear down, essentially. The only way to combat these negative beliefs that we really deeply believe to be true, the only way to combat them is to break them down. And that takes a lot of time with positivity in general, positive experiences, positive relationships, positive environments, support, encouragement, all of those things makes it much easier to start to break down the negative beliefs. Lesson 5, the last lesson, I learned that opposites can be true, like joy and sadness. If you've seen Inside Out.
And there, perfect. This is the circle of sadness. Your job is to make sure that all the sadness stays inside of it.
You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Try to separate out the sadness from the joy, so that way we don't feel sadness, only feel joy. The dialectical of some of those, I'm struggling with the judgment piece of my mental health wellness. I'm still working on that, right? Like I'm too judgmental. And I've also made a lot of progress in a lot of other areas in my life and internally. I think that dialectical thinking has relieved some of my suffering as well, like radical acceptance has, because it's kind of liberated me. I understand now that I can be mad. I can be angry with our kids and still love them. I love them a lot, you know? So yeah, that's 5 things I've learned in 1 year of DBT therapy. Thank you for joining me. If you like the video, you can subscribe and you can get notified when I post new videos every once in a while. Take good care of yourself.